Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Sam Glazer-Hewson here at the University of Minnesota Alumni Association, and I'm excited to welcome you to today's webinar. Today's webinar is a part of the Future in Focus series, and it's called Attachment Styles Decoded, the data behind our adult relationship patterns. This session is being recorded today, and it will be shared with everyone who has registered and also uploaded to YouTube and Goldmine for continued access. You will also receive a follow-up email that includes our program evaluation, ways to keep being involved, and even an opportunity to be a part of research. So be sure to stay tuned. As questions arise during today's expert talk, please submit them through the Zoom Q&A function, and I will be moderating those as they come in. Next, I'm excited to introduce our featured speaker and University of Minnesota expert today, Jeff Simpson. Jeffrey A. Simpson, PhD, is a distinguished university teaching professor and the current chair of the Department of Psychology here at the University of Minnesota. His research focuses on adult attachment, social influence, and how developmental experiences are related to various outcomes in adulthood. He has served as an editor of Personal Relationships and the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Interpersonal Relations and Group Processes. He's also a past president of the International Association for Relationship Research. Now, I'm personally so excited to learn more about the topic today, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Jeff Simpson.
Hi there. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for spending your lunchtime with me, and I'm excited to talk about some new work that we've done recently that has taken years to develop and accumulate, and it's hot off the press. And so you're going to be hearing basically stuff that many people have not heard yet, which is exactly what I was hoping. Can everyone see my slides? Does it look good there? Okay. What I'd like to do is first acknowledge my collaborators in this project. This is a study that's taken literally 30 years to do. I particularly want to highlight Keely Dugan, the lead author on this paper, who did a lot of the tough statistical modeling, Chris Fraley at the University of Illinois, and Glenn Roisman, who's here at Minnesota and the Institute of Child Development, and my other co-authors, because this work could not be done without a village of people, quite literally. So what I would like to do today is, if I can get my screen to advance. Okay, I'm not able to do it. There we go. What I want to do today, here's an overview. I want to talk about how childhood bonds shape adult relationships, different kinds of relationships. Relationships with our parents, both mother and father if they're still alive, relationships with our romantic partner, relationships with our close friends. So I'll begin by talking a little bit about John Bowlby's attachment theory, just very briefly to give you an idea of the theoretical background. Then I'll talk in a little bit more detail about adult attachment styles, how they're measured and kind of what they reflect. And hopefully you'll be able to kind of figure out where you are on these adult attachment style dimensions that I'll be talking about, so you can kind of place it in the context of your life as well. I'll talk a little bit about the importance of early social experiences and the kinds of things that we measured in this longitudinal study over many years. And then I'll talk about the new findings that just came out literally about 6 to 8 weeks ago in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and leave you with some takeaways and some implications, some larger picture things that you might want to know or might want to think about as we end the talk. So attachment theory was developed by a psychiatrist slash psychologist named John Bowlby starting in the late 1960s. And what he realized is that humans are born in a very neonatal state. I mean, when we think about infants, not only can they not take care of themselves and they can't feed themselves, they can't even move. They, unlike many other primates, they can't move. So because of this, we're in infancy in particular, we're very vulnerable, and we have to have other stronger, wiser, older people protect us and take care of us. We're born to bond, and we're usually born to bond with our parents, our caregivers initially. And if we didn't have these kind of innate tendencies to bond, both on the side of the child and also on the side of the parent, the mother and the father, we probably wouldn't survive. Individuals would not survive given the state of nature. So attachment theory explains both how and why bonds developed, beginning initially with our first caregivers, usually our parents, but also later in life as we develop new attachment relationships with other people who are meaningful and significant to us, like close friends and romantic partners. And one of the key premises of the theory over the years has been that the quality of experiences that you have with different people who are these attachment figures across your life, that should shape what you expect and can expect from people in future relationships. It's kind of something that is the initial sentence in many papers that attachment relationships start in infancy, and those early relationships are the beginning of the formation of expectations for how you're going to be treated by different people who are close to you across your life. But what's a bit surprising is even though this is a central premise of the theory, we don't, until recently, have good evidence of it using prospective longitudinal studies that have large samples and have the right measures of experience with different people at the right time. And we finally do, and this is the study that I'll be talking about today. So what Bowlby argued basically is that these early experiences kind of give people an indication of what they can expect from future partners and relationships, particularly when they need help, care, or support, particularly when they're distressed or they're overly challenged or they feel fatigued, ill, afraid. And his idea was that even though there's a lot of flexibility in the system, these early experiences lay down a blueprint or kind of a roadmap for how you should think, feel, and behave in later relationships with other attachment figures later in life. In other words, these early experiences, even though things might change across development, they still may be in your head and still may shape the way you think about relationships with other people in different relationships 20 or 30, even 30 or more years later. So one of the two of the questions that we had was, is this map, is this initial blueprint for life, is it permanent or is it even still there 20 or 30 years later? And is it also affected by how the way in which we develop new relationships with different people as we move through the life course? So adult attachment styles are usually measured, they're measured in different ways, but they're usually measured with simple self-report questionnaires. I'll show you some example items and some of that formatting here in a moment. But what I want to do right now is to talk a little bit about what we know about the three primary, I call them normative attachment styles that kind of define adult relationships. And there are more than three, but these are the three primary ones that we talk about theoretically and that have reasonably large numbers of people who fit into these different general categories. So attachment anxiety, people who score high in attachment anxiety, they fear rejection. They fear that their partner is going to leave them. And they need continual reassurance that that's not going to happen. So these individuals usually have had experiences in the past, or so the theory goes, where their partners have not always been there for them when they needed them. Sometimes they have, sometimes they haven't. And so they've learned that they have to be hyper vigilant and they have to protest and get their partner's attention in order to feel secure in their relationships. Highly anxious people, as you might expect, are kind of challenging partners to have because they're very demanding and they're always needing continual reassurance, which can be very difficult for a partner to provide continually. Attachment avoidance is defined by being uncomfortable with intimacy and wanting and valuing being self-reliant, independent, and autonomous. So people who score high on avoidance typically have been pushed away. They've not just been totally rejected, but in the past, people have been close to them, have not treated them very well, and they've had to learn to be independent, to get things done on their own, and to cope by basically just being self-reliant. Attachment security is defined by being comfortable with intimacy, being comfortable with emotional closeness and sharing, and using and relying on your partners for help, care, and support when you need it. So especially when you're distressed, secure people, they basically have not just themselves to try to deal with the problem, they believe that they have their partner as well to help them figure things out. Um, and as you might expect, these different attachment styles, which are measured, they're not categories, they're measured on continuous dimensions from low through moderate to high. We know a lot about them now in terms of what they're correlated with in adulthood. So anxious people and avoidant people tend to have difficulty in relationships. Their partners have difficulty dealing with them. They tend to have slightly more mental health kinds of problems, not necessarily to a clinical level, but problems that are on that spectrum, moving toward depression and anxiety and things like this. And they also tend to be low in general life well-being. Secure people, on the other hand, are pretty much the opposite. They enjoy their relationships. They get a lot out of them. They value them very highly. They rely on their partners. Their partners usually come through for them. And so their mental and physical well-being tends to be better in general. Okay, so if you think about these attachment relationships, they're structured in your mind in different kinds of ways. But one general way to think of the structure is the one I'm showing here, this kind of tripartite three-level structure. So in a general level, in terms of general attachment, people have a kind of an inkling about whether or not they can trust and count on other people in general, people they've met. Some people say, yeah, I can definitely do that on a scale of 1 to 7, where 7 is it's a lot. I can definitely do that. They may say I'm a 6 or a 7. Some people say, I don't know. In general, I don't know if I can really count and trust and depend on people. They'd be maybe more toward the middle of the scale. And people who have been really treated very badly would be low on the scale. And we typically don't measure general attachment because it's not very specific. It's a reflection or an amalgamation of all the people you know and you've interacted with um, throughout your life. We typically measure things at either the middle level or the lowest level. And I'm going to talk about mainly the lowest level today, just to keep things simple. So we also have in our minds these models, these expectations of how can we count on and trust and rely on our parents, mom and dad, to help us when we need help, especially again when we're challenged, distressed, ill, etc. So we have a parent model. Is an amalgamation of mom and dad and maybe other parent-like figures, could be foster parents, etc. We then also have a romantic domain. Many of us have a series of past romantic partners, and we can kind of aggregate across them to get an idea of what's the degree to which I can count on my romantic partners when I need them. And then we also have friends, a lot of friends usually, more friends than romantic partners typically, and we can create and do create a mental model of can I count and trust and depend on my friends. What I'm going to talk about today is the lowest level, which is specific people. So we also have a specific attachment style and set of expectations with regard to our mother, with regard to our father, with regard to our current romantic partner, with regard to maybe an ex-partner, with regard to our best friend, or maybe someone who's close to us at work. And what I'm going to talk about today is 4 of those types of specific relationships. Attachment styles to mother, approximately at age 30, attachment styles to your father, attachment styles to your current romantic partner, and attachment styles to your best friend. Okay, that's a general idea of the structure of, it's not structured in the head exactly this way, but this is one way to conceptualize how attachment styles are structured mentally in individuals. So let me talk a little bit more about this. Let me kind of now show you how attachment styles relate to each other. And they fall within what we call a two-dimensional space. And it looks more complicated than it really is. So on the y-axis, on the vertical axis, you have the degree to which people have a positive model or a positive view of their attachment figures. So people who have a positive model at the top there tend to score low on avoidance. If you look toward the bottom, people who have a negative model of others tend to score high in avoidance. And so one of the markers of avoidance is you don't think you can count on other people. You don't have a good view of them. Whereas people who are more secure, they do have a more positive model. They think they can count on their partner. The second dimension, the one on the horizontal axis, is the model of yourself as a relationship partner. This is not general self-esteem. This is your view of, are you worthy of love and care and affection in a close relationship with your mother, your father, your romantic partner, or a friend? And it ranges from having a very, on the right side, a very negative model of yourself where you don't think you're worthy, to on the left side, a more positive model of this of yourself, thinking that, yeah, I deserve to be treated well. I deserve to be, given support and care, especially when I need it. So what security is, if you look at the upper left-hand quadrant, security is reflected in people who have a positive view of others, their partners, and a positive view of themselves. And thus you can see why they turn to others. They think they're worthy of care and support. Others are likely to be there for them. On the upper right-hand side, you have anxious people. Anxious people have a positive view of others, but it's more guarded. They hope others are going to be there for them. They're not quite sure. They've had a rough time in the past, but they tend to have a negative view of themselves. They think that they don't measure up. They think that they're not necessarily worth it. And so that negative view of themselves affects the dynamics of their relationships, oftentimes in a negative way. They ruminate, they engage in emotional coping, which involves focusing on how you feel as opposed to how can you solve the problem that's currently in front of you. If you look at the bottom, you have avoidant people. We call them dismissive avoidance now on the lower left-hand quadrant. So dismissive people have a positive but brittle view of themselves. They think that they're above everybody else. They think that they really don't need attachment relationships because they're independent, they're self-reliant, and they have a negative view of partners because they've been burned or rebuffed in the past. And so that combination is what leads avoidant people to think, feel, and behave the way they do. On the right side, you have fearful people, and we've learned over the years that fearful people really, they can be both anxious or avoidant depending on the situation, but fearful people who have a negative view of who they are and a negative view of others, they tend to vacillate back and forth between acting like an anxious person or acting like a dismissive, avoidant person. But on average, in the context of relationships, their behavior is more avoidant than anxious. And so that gives you an idea of what these different styles are like. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about avoidance as being both the lower part of the model, both avoidant, dismissive people and fearful people together. I'll talk about security and anxiousness separately. But the one thing to keep in mind here is that in the way we measure it, we measure these two dimensions, positive model of others, positive model of self on continuous scales. And uh, security is defined by being low on avoidance, in other words, having a positive model of others, and also being low on anxiety, having a positive view of who you are. So if you look at the left side of the figure, here are three items that we actually used in our adult attachment style scale. We asked more than three. These are three exemplars. So here are three sample items. I feel comfortable depending on X, and they would answer it 4 times. I feel comfortable depending on my mom. I feel comfortable depending on my dad. I feel comfortable depending on my current romantic partner. I feel comfortable depending on my best friend. Another item, it helps to turn to X, again, 4 different people, in times of need, answered separately for each person. And I'm very comfortable being close to X, answered 4 times, once for each partner. And the scaling there is on the bottom. So a 1 on a 7-point scale stands for strongly disagree. A 4 is in the middle, moderate, midpoint, and a 7 is I strongly agree. So a secure person would have high scores on all of these 7 items, a 6 or a 7 usually. They would say, I feel comfortable depending on X. It helps me to turn to them when I need them. and I feel comfortable being emotionally close to them. An avoidant people would have low scores on all three, and an anxious person probably is going to be a little bit more in the middle. And so you can think about them as more guarded. They want to be close to other people. They really, really value that, but they're not sure they're going to be able to attain that. Okay, so the key research questions that drove this research basically are twofold. One, does the quality of a person's relationship starting early in life predict their adult attachment styles in terms of the anxiety and avoidance dimensions with their mothers, their fathers, their close friends, and or their romantic partners in early to middle adulthood at around age 30. And that's not ever been studied with really good measures and large samples across the lifespan until now. Second, what kinds of early experiences with which people, mothers, fathers, romantic partners, friends, predict a person's adult attachment styles to different types of partners. So, for example, is relationship with one of your parents really, really important in predicting all of your attachment relationship styles? Or is it only limited to your attachment to that person 20, 25, 30 years later? Okay, so the data we pulled from is from the study of early child care and youth development. It's a longitudinal study that was started in the early 1990s. And what they did was they got a nationally representative sample from 10 locations around the country. And each location had the exact same protocol, the exact same measures, the exact same instructions. They just recruited approximately 100 or so people from around their location. And so the study became one of over 1,000 people in all. And as you can see there on the right, I know it's hard to see probably, but this is the only figure I could get on here. Um, they started measuring them very, very early in life, just after they were born, recruiting their parents. And then they were measured not every year, but most years from between the time they were born, 0 there on the left, all the way to about age 30, 31 on the right. And you probably can't read this, but I can indicate what it says. There were all kinds of data that were collected, all kinds of, this is what makes the study so unique. It's the right measures at the right time, done the right way. And it's hard to do these studies, as you can imagine. So at various points in time, there were in-person behavioral observations of how the participants who were growing up were treated by their mom, their dad, teachers, romantic partners, friends. There were assessments done in child care centers, in schools by teachers, in neighborhood settings. There were physical exams. There were interviews, self-report questionnaires. It was very, very detailed. And I'm only going to focus today just on one very, very small part of this data set, and that is what kinds of experiences early in life predict your adult attachment styles to these four kinds of relationships many, many years later. We had 705 participants in the final sample because we had some missing data. You have that with longitudinal studies. And they were measured again at multiple points in time. I'll give you an example of some of this just here in a moment. Again, starting in infancy, through childhood, through adolescence, and into early adulthood. 53.6% of the sample initially were identified as female, 46.4 as male. They, again, were a nationally representative sample, and the last assessment was done at around almost 29 years of age. That's the outcome of measuring attachment on anxiety and avoidance to your mom, your dad, your current partner, and your best friend. Get to take a little bit more specific dive into kind of what we measured to answer the questions in this study. We measured the quality of each participant's relationships with their mom and their dad, the quality of their friendships over time, and the quality of their romantic relationships. And then again, at about age 29 or age 30, we gave them the self-report anxiety and avoidance adult attachment questionnaires answered with respect to their mom, their dad, their best friend, and their romantic partner. And here's even a deeper dive into the measures because I think it's really important to understand what the measures were to understand the findings. So within the parent domain, at multiple points in time, Mothers and fathers were video recorded interacting with their child, the target participant in the study, in stressful situations that are standardized and used in developmental psychology. So if you want to get a good glimpse of parenting, you don't look at parents interacting with kids when there's no stress. Everyone can be a good parent when the stress is low. But when children are having to do stuff that's above their ability, above their knowledge or their emotional capacity, that's when parenting comes out and you see variation across parents. And so we coded what was called sensitive parenting. And what this is done by both the mother and the father in separate experimental sessions at multiple points in time. Sensitive parenting involves the extent to which not just you're warm and you're supportive, but you structure a situation, you scaffold things to allow the child to kind of figure it out as best they can on their own, and you only intervene when you need to. But in the end, because you're kind of like more invisible at some level, the child, regardless of their age, feels they did it on their own and they own it. And that's a critical part of security and sensitivity in parenting. You're not a helicopter parent. You're not doing the things for the kids if they can't do them. You are trying to help them do the best they can, and then you accept that and you communicate that acceptance. Some parents do that. Some parents take the task over, get mad at the child. That's insensitive parenting. We also had self-report measures by mom and dad at multiple points in time of how much conflict they had with their child, how close they were with their child, and also the children, once they could report on scales, indicated how much warmth they felt from their mother and their father separately, and also how much hostility defined their relationship with each of those people. And again, these measures were taken at 5 or 6 points in time, which has got some real advantages. I'll show you here that in a moment. In the friendship domain, the participants reported on the quality of their friendships starting in grade school when they could make those evaluations and continuing into adolescence and early adulthood. And also the social competence they had or displayed with peers were rated by their mother, their father, and their grade school teachers. That's really important because grade school teachers are around kids of a given age. They know what competence looks like in a third grader, if they're a third grade teacher, or in a fifth grader, in a ninth grader. And so the teacher reports were really important and unique because, again, they're in some respects probably a less biased and maybe more expert observer of social competence of the children. And then in the romantic domain, and this occurred a bit later, the Ps that reported on conflict and support they had with the different romantic partners that they were involved with. But again, this was a bit later in their development. Okay, for those of you who like statistics, here's an example of a statistical model. The modeling is pretty complicated, and this is where Keely Dugan, the lead author, really came through. This is just one model, but it gives you an idea of, I think, how the data was structured and how we got to the results that we did. If you look at the bottom, this is a model for the impact of friendship quality, and the outcome at the top is anxiety in general, but also anxiety with regard to mom, with regard to dad, with regard to romantic partner, with regard to best friend. So what you can do if you have these models and you have multiple ratings. So what we have here is we have a measure of friendship quality at grade 3, self-report, teacher report, mom report, dad report, aggregated. And then we have the same thing, grade 4, grade 5, grade 6, age 15, age 18. So what you can do if you have data like this is you can do two cool things. Of course, you can get the average or the mean score, but you can also get what we call the slope. Change. You can look at change. Think about it for a second. If you start out having poor quality friendships in third grade, but it gets better and better and better, and by the time you're 18, it's good, that change, that slope of variable, that amount of change could also predict above and beyond the mean what you're like with regard to anxiety in different types of relationships. And so the neat thing about doing this kind of modeling is you can look at the mean, score, and you can look at change across time in predicting these various outcomes. So this is just one model. We also had a model for romantic relationship quality. We had a model for quality of relationship with the dad, a different one, quality of the relationship with the mom. And then we had another set of predictors or outcomes. We also had attachment avoidance. Anxiety and avoidance, again, are the two outcome measures that we assessed. So that gives you an idea in terms of the modeling, kind of what things look like. So what we find, I'm only going to talk about 4 findings here, the 4 main findings, and we can discuss others in the Q&A if you'd like to. One of the things that we found, which probably doesn't surprise a lot of you, especially if you're a mom, moms are foundational. So the quality of earlier mother-child bonds predict individuals, their child's attachment, anxiety, and avoidance, both in every type of adult relationship. So, in other words, greater maternal sensitivity, closeness and support, and less conflict, as measured by all of those things that I talked about before, so was associated with being more secure in all adult relationships with your friends, your romantic partners, even with your dad, and of course, also with your mom. And so what this indicates is that mothers are a pivotal, broad foundation for guiding the formation of later attachment. They play a huge, huge role. This is something that Bowlby anticipated, but I don't think he necessarily anticipated that the foundation of the maternal bond would predict, let's say, the quality necessarily of your friendships or your adult romantic relationships, but it clearly does in our analyses. Okay. We also found that peers make a huge difference. So friendship quality in childhood predicted also later attachment, but primarily romantic attachment. So the quality of earlier peer relationships, for example, predicted your level of avoidance with adult partners. So, for example, higher friendship quality and more social competence, again, rated by not only the participants themselves, but by their teachers and their mom and their dad, all aggregated, predicted higher security in later romantic relationships. And so we think that the implication of this is that friends teach us how to engage in and manage intimacy in more equal status relationships. So parent-child relationships are what we call vertical relationships because there's a power difference, there's a knowledge difference, there's strong norm difference in terms of what's acceptable for a parent to do versus a child. But when children move out of the nuclear family and into the environment of the school, all of a sudden it's a horizontal relationship. You're dealing with people who have no more power than you do necessarily. They have the same amount of knowledge, they're at the same developmental stage as you, and you have to learn how to negotiate that. Horizontal relationships with friends are very different, not only in terms of their structure, but in terms of psychology, compared to vertical relationships between, let's say, parents and children. Or another example might be of a vertical relationship might be boss, supervisee, if it's a very close relationship. Friends are really important. There's the power of peers. Also, we found change effects, which again, this is something that Bowlby didn't really talk about, but we had the ability to do it given the way we were doing the modeling. And so what we found was that increases in the quality of relationships with mothers and peers in particular predicted more attachment security. So if you were on an upward trajectory, things might have started off bad with your mom, but they got better over time, or you had a difficult time with your peers in second or third and fourth grade, but they got better by the time you reached high school. That also, independently of the overall quality, predicted being more secure in your relationships. So the implication here is that changes are impactful, and what's important to know is not only where things begin or what the average is, it's also what happens during development. And again, some people improved in terms of the quality of their peer relationships or their relationships with their mothers. Others, many were flat, they didn't change much. Some went down. And so there were people, if their relationships went down in quality, they experienced downturns and more insecurity in their later adult attachment relationships. So if you're like me, you might think, where the hell are fathers? What about fathers? Are the fathers just inconsequential? We didn't find any significant effects for the quality of relationships with fathers, but one thing to keep in mind is that we are only measuring one thing. We're only measuring attachment. We're not measuring other outcomes like the general self-esteem of the child, like the competence that the child has in various life outcomes or life settings, the quality of their mental health. Fathers do make a difference when it comes to some of those outcomes, but they don't make a difference, according to what we found at least, in terms of predicting adult attachment and different types of relationships downstream. So you might say, well, why? And well, we don't actually know, but there are three things that we talked about in the paper. One, and this is changing, but it's still true to some extent, and maybe more than some, fathers just spend less time caring for kids than mothers do. I mean, the ideal today is that it's going to be a 50-50 deal between moms and dads. You look at data even today, division of housework is not 50-50. Mothers are doing more, especially early in life. Mothers continue to do more childcare than dads do. Dads do pick up as kids get older, but not in the formative first 3 to 5 years of life, not as much. Also, mothers typically interact more with their kids, especially when they need soothing and comfort. Think about it. If you're a parent and both you and your partner are in the house and your child has a problem, who do they run to? Do they run to the dad? Could be. Do they run to the mom? More likely. So the moms are in a position where they can affect the child and affect their attachment styles because, again, attachment is indexed by, do you believe and do you expect that you're going to get good care when you need it, when you need soothing? And moms are more likely in that role. That may be why they're foundational. However, fathers do play a larger role in development later in life. They play a critical role in terms of playing with kids, learning social skills, engaging in activities. So this is not to denigrate the role of fathers. But one of the things that we've learned in developmental psychology over the years is that fathers, we need to know more about them. We need to know more about what they're doing or what they're not doing in terms of the development of their children. Okay, so these effects are not huge. This is not a deterministic model by any means. So mother-child quality predicted a small amount of variance in adult attachment styles, 5 or 6%. It's not a lot. And friendship quality predicted slightly more variance, about 10% in romantic attachment. That may be because the friendship measures were taken a little bit later, closer to when people entered romantic relationships in early adulthood. So even though these effects seem small, they're durable. They're still there 20, 25, 30 years later. And this is important because a lot happens between early in life and age 28 or 29 or 30. A lot of things intervene that can and do affect your adult attachment styles. You experience betrayals. You have a mentor come in, a coach or someone who comes in and shows you what a supportive relationship looks like. We didn't measure that, right? You experience hardship, life stress. People die. You don't know how to deal with it. Friends around you don't know how to deal with it, etc. So there's a lot of things that happen in between. And the fact that there's still a signal from earlier in life, I think is fairly impressive. One thing is I like to say, to think about the impact of small actions on big changes is if you're, let's say you're a baseball fan, what's the difference between a batter whose lifetime batting average is, let's say, 310, which means they get 310 hits per 1,000 at bats, versus a player who has 280 hits in 1,000 at bats? That's only a difference of 30 hits per 1,000. What's the difference? The Hall of Fame. The 310 hitter probably will go to the Hall of Fame. The 280 hitter could, depends on what else they do, but probably not. So sometimes, and the same thing with sensitivity, maybe just a little more sensitivity, just a little bit more would allow someone to become more secure in a different type of relationship in adulthood. And we just, that metric, we're still kind of trying to figure out what is the critical point or threshold at which you need sensitivity to get you into what we consider a secure range. We still don't know the answer to that. So what are the practical implications, right? We're doing this work, and it's interesting theoretically. Bowlby probably would be happy with what we did. I think he would. I don't know for sure. But what are the practical implications? And one of the things in psychology that we care about is the so what, and there actually are a ton of practical implications here. There really are. For parents, early sensitivity has a 30-year return on investment. And what's mind-boggling to me is that it doesn't cost that much money to teach parents through childbirth classes how to be sensitive to a 6 week old, a 6 month old, a 3 year old, a 6 year old, because many parents don't know developmentally what a child can do mentally and emotionally at different ages. And you have to adjust your caregiving and your sensitivity to what they can do. And you can train this. They do it in Europe on a regular basis, and it works actually. The implications for educators, social emotional learning and peer play are not just extra things. The playground is just not only for fun, it's foundational. It's where children learn to get along in more of a horizontal equal status relationship, and it has great implications for their later romantic relationships, whether or not they're treated well and they're competent with their peers or not. For adults, understanding your default settings. What are your default settings in terms of your attachment to your partner or your friends or even your parents? And what can you do to change your attachment styles in different types of relationships? It's got a lot of implications for that, I think. So there's hope for change. Again, childhood experiences are only a predictor. They're a correlated prospective predictor of these adult attachment styles. They're not predetermined. And again, most of our adult attachment styles are shaped by a multitude of other experiences and other people beyond what we could measure in the study for logical limitations. But there's an idea in attachment that's very important. It's an idea that's called earned security. And the idea is that you can change your attachment by choosing secure partners, by establishing healthy relationships that function in a supportive, mutually supportive way, and sometimes also by seeking therapy. And in fact, a lot of couples marital therapy is basically using attachment principles to rebuild the trust that's been lost in a relationship, to rebuild the hope for the relationship, to rebuild ways to give your partner credit when they should get credit for something they've done that's very good, but also to hold them accountable when they've fallen short. Okay, so in conclusion, to kind of step back and wrap things up here, human connection is a lifelong developmental process, and the long arc of development shows that the quality of early care and support stays with most of us. It changes, but it stays with most of us. There's still a signal there from earlier in life, even if we aren't fully aware of it. And that both the nursery and the playground are initial training grounds for important patterns of human connection. And so to close, I want to thank our supporting agencies, especially the National Institute of Health. They started this study back in the early 1990s, and it's been continuing ever since. It's taken a ton of time and effort and money to collect this data, but it's very, very valuable. And again, there are all kinds of other variables that are measured. This study has generated literally hundreds and hundreds of really important papers. I also want to thank the National Science Foundation. Although the National Science Foundation didn't fund this study, they funded a lot of my attachment research over the years, looking at how adult couples communicate during conflict and support. And that's informed my thinking on this developmental work that we've done here. You can see there, if you have questions, there's my email. Also, if you want to see my webpage, it's listed right there. The webpage kind of describes in more detail the general stuff that we're doing. I also want to finally thank, once again, my colleagues and the Institute of Child Development at Minnesota, which, as many of you may know, is like the leading child development department in the world. And a lot of really terrific work comes out of there. I'm lucky to be an adjunct faculty member over there, in addition to being our department, which is also a very, very strong department. So I think I'll stop there and maybe take some questions. Thank you.
Wow. Dr. Simpson, thank you so much for sharing all this with us. I think it's been amazing to know this data is so new and that we're already able to access it through you. So thank you for the wonderful presentation. We have had a lot of questions come in, so I'm going to jump right in. The first question we received is, where do siblings fit into the structure of attachment relationships?
Very good question. Very good question. Um, they do fit in. They do fit in. And one of the things that we found over the years is that you would think that, parents would have the same kind of relationship with children a couple years apart. But children are they're not passive, they're very reactive, and they can shape the nature of the relationship with the parent. And so one of the things that we found over the years is that you could have one child who is securely attached with you and another that's not quite so securely attached, partly as a function of the dynamic of the two people. And I think the question probably more pertains to, what about the two siblings? What if one is, let's say, secure and the other's insecure? We don't know nearly enough about siblings in the context of attachment. That's one of the things that's difficult to study, and you can see why. To get to be able to make inferences from this kind of data, you need to collect hundreds of families. And families differ in their structure. Some have one child, some have two, some have three. Also, the gender differences. You might have two girls in the family and two boys. And those relationships of the siblings may be quite a bit different as a function of gender socialization. So we really don't know enough about that right now. I wish I could answer the question, but that's something that family scholars are hoping to be able to study in the future with larger data sets.
That's really helpful to know. Another question we received is kind of how this data maybe has been influenced by generations over time. So your study specifically straddled millennials and Gen Z. Do you think your results would be the same from earlier cohorts and or future ones such as the alphas?
Um, Certainly the way different generations interact with parents has changed, partly as a function of social media changes. Um, and that's something that we're studying right now. To what extent is social media affecting attachment relationships and the way people communicate? I can't really address that right now, although I know a lot of people who are kind of looking at that. I do think, though, that this that given how foundational the need for care and support is, and as long as parents and partners are providing the sensitive care that's culturally appropriate and also appropriate for what that person needs, that's really critical. It's called tailored support. I think that what you'd find similar results. Now, if there are some cross-cultural differences. There are some cultures where it's more normative to be strict and a bit punitive, and that tends to make people a bit more avoidant. There are other cultures where parents are more likely to kind of like not be helicopter parents, but kind of be structuring the child's life in a very, very direct way. And the more normative thing there is being a bit more anxious. Um, but I think that as long as the care and responsiveness is tailored to both the individual, given their generational culture, I think you'd find the same basic patterns. I think you would.
That's a good inference. I appreciate thinking about that over generations and how we learn as we go on and
Yeah, I mean,
hopefully
what
maybe
what
improve.
sensitive care um, in the 1970s might have been paying attention to your kid at the dinner table and maybe asking a few questions. What sensitive care today may look quite a bit different, but the child will still kind of absorb what's culturally and normatively relevant.
We actually have a couple of other questions about the demographics of people, and if you have any information about differences in the outcomes based on demographic backgrounds such as gender, race, ethnicity,
Excellent
socioeconomic
question.
status, and then
Excellent.
also related about if we have same-sex couples as parents, if you had any
Right. Right.
indications there.
I didn't mention this and didn't show it in the models because what we did is we statistically controlled for a bunch of those things, whether or not the participant identified as female or male, the SES of the family, the ethnicity of the target person, et cetera. For the most part, the effects held. They especially held for the impact of the mothers and friends. Some of the effects got a little bit weaker, but they're not appreciably weaker. And so we did control for those things as best we could. I didn't show that in the model because it would make the model too complicated. The question about parents who are, same sex, that's a really, really good question. In this study, given the way the samples were recruited, it was primarily heterosexual parents who were recruited. There were some people who shifted and left the relationship and started a same-sex relationship later on, but there weren't enough of them to really analyze the data and make inferences from. But what I can say is that in other studies that have begun to look at this, same-sex parents look very, very similar to opposite-sex parents. The patterns look the same, the functioning looks the same, the outcomes are just as good. Um, they're very, very similar. Whether or not that's true in this study, we just don't know. We can't really say.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think it's interesting. There could be so much more attached to each data point that it gets complicated to actually then
Very, very
communicate it.
complicated. I mean, again, in the development, a lot occurs during development that in this study, we couldn't assess. And that's why I say the fact that you've got effectively a correlation of 0.25 between the quality of care you get from your mom or changes in it and your attachment to your romantic partner, that's pretty impressive given everything that can happen to a person in those intervening years.
Absolutely. All right, we have a few more questions that have come in. Related to your key finding number 3, what are the factors behind improvements in relationship quality? We had another related question about how much self-influence can you have over adjusting this if you're not happy with how you're currently operating?
Very good question. There are programs in Europe that I think this is one way to answer the question. They've identified parents who are at risk demographically in terms of SES, et cetera. And there are training modules that show you what does sensitive parenting look like with children of different ages. And they model it with them. How do you hold the baby? How do you talk to the baby? What's their vocal tone? How do you allow your child to learn to help themselves? And when do you intervene and provide assistance and then back away? So one of the things I think about security is the parents are kind of going in and out and in and out. And it's almost imperceptible to the child. You can see it if you're an observer, but they know when to scaffold and help out and when to pull away and let the child do it on their own. They know when the child has reached a point, and this could be true of romantic partners too, where they really do need you to intervene. They have an intuitive feel for it. Um, Another thing that people don't do well enough is they have a generic idea of what support should look like, but they don't think about what their partner needs. Their partner may not need a lot of emotional reassurance necessarily in a given situation. What they might need is, I'm there to listen, and I'm there to help you out in any way that I can. But we don't have to talk about it right now. And that may be exactly what you need. Whereas on the support provider, they may be thinking, oh, I need to provide heavy emotional support now. So learning how to tailor what your partner needs, given the situation, is important. And that can also be taught.
That's comforting to know that we can still learn some of these things as life goes by.
Believe me, I'm learning every day.
We have another good question, and maybe this was in the data or not. Was there an attachment difference between personality types? So things like extroversion or
Yeah,
introversion?
good question. So I've actually done some work looking at attachment and personality, and one of the correlations the effects are small, but one of the things that you find is that people who are more agreeable are more likely to be secure. They're easier to get along with. They're better listeners. So that the trait of agreeableness is correlated with security. The trait of neuroticism tends to be correlated with anxiety. These correlations are not large, 20, 25, maybe 30, neuroticism and anxiety. And the difference is that neuroticism is, in general, you are anxious and worried about all situations, not just attachment situations, about all people you're around. It's like a pervasive sense of anxiety. Whereas attachment anxiety is in the context of close relationships with close partners, I feel anxious. And so it's a bit more of it's a subtype of anxiety, and it should be correlated with a marker of anxiety in the big five, which of course is neuroticism. Good question.
Yeah, thank you for that one. All right, we have one more that's kind of general and then a couple more wrap-up questions that I'll get to after that. We have a question here about children that were adopted. And then kind of related, is there an effect from divorce that you note in the study at all?
I don't know the answer about in this study, but I do know that divorce does tend to make people a bit less secure in their romantic relationships over time. That oftentimes, though, is corrected by who their partner is and how their partner treats them. And so what you often find is that if you are a child of divorce, you kind of enter thinking, well, this may not last forever. And that affects the way you relate to your partner. But over time, if your partner shows they're rock solid there for you, um, you begin to change your style as a function of your immediate environment, which is your partner. And so that's one way to kind of think about that.
All right, so for our wrap-up questions here, where can people find more of this research if they want to dive in themselves?
Oh, there's tons of it on the internet. I mean, when I first started doing this work back 35 years ago, there were like 10 of us, maybe more. There might have been more in developmental psychology, but not in social psychology or personality where I'm in. And now there's a cottage industry out there. So if you go onto the internet and you type in attachment theory, attachment studies, you're going to find a boatload of things. The one thing that I would recommend, though, is one of the co-authors of our paper, Chris Fraley, who's at the University of Illinois. His name is spelled Fraley. Chris Fraley. He's got an excellent website at the University of Illinois that not only describes the work that's being done in attachment, including this study, but also a lot more, but also things you can take. You can take these scales. And I believe he's got one part of the website where you can get a score and you can participate in studies that he's running online. So I would recommend going to a reputable scholar, attachment scholar, and Chris Fraley at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana is the person I would check out.
That's fantastic. And then the last question we had, I know you already put your email address up at the end of your slides.
Mhm.
Is that the best way that people can follow up with you if they have additional questions?
Yeah, that would be probably the best way. Yep. Yeah, it would. And again, I just want to thank you for listening because for me, this was a study that I always wanted to do, and I never thought I'd be able to be involved with it because it's so difficult to collect this kind of data, and it takes 30 years. Or we're going to still follow them, but it's really a smoking gun study in the sense that it really shed some light on a very fundamental proposition in attachment theory that the past does matter, even today.
It's amazing that you were able to put this together in such a way that it's easy for us to understand and the data that backs up the things that we're reading and learning about the world around us, especially for those of us who are parents. I think it's just so invaluable. So thank you so much for your time today and willingness to share with us.
Thank you.
So I'm going to take us through our wrap-up slides here. We have a couple of upcoming webinars that will continue next week as part of our Future in Focus series. We have one next week about dual career households in the economy, and the following week we'll have one on Minnesota's demographics from Susan Brower, our state demographer. The first week of March we'll continue with understanding cannabis in Minnesota today. We want to thank our members for powering everything we do here at the Alumni Association and all of you for joining in today. Thank you so much for your time, and to Dr. Jeff Simpson, again, for being an amazing expert speaker. Thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your day.